I signed the divorce papers in silence, my hands steady even though my entire life was collapsing in front of me. Daniel Carter didn't even look at me when he pushed the documents back across the table, just leaned back in his chair like he had already won something I didn't know I was competing for. "This is the easiest decision I've made all year," he said coldly, tapping the pen once like I was just another transaction in his corporate world. The lawyer between us didn't speak, just watched me like I was supposed to break down. But I didn't. I just stared at the ink drying on paper that used to represent 7 years of marriage. I want you to pause for a second here. And if this story even slightly speaks to your heart, take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your city right now, because I want to know how far this moment is reaching. My name is Olivia Carter. I'm 34 years old, and what you are about to hear is the night my entire family reality shattered in ways I never saw coming. And it all began with a marriage I thought I understood until I realized I never really existed in it at all. It started in our apartment in downtown Chicago, the one we picked together but somehow stopped feeling like mine the moment Daniel changed. That night, he didn't even pretend anymore. He stood by the kitchen counter scrolling through his phone while I sat at the dining table signing the last page. "You'll get your settlement," he said without looking up. "It's more than fair. You should be grateful I didn't drag this out." I remember laughing once, not because it was funny, but because it felt unreal. "Grateful?" I repeated quietly. He finally looked at me then, just briefly, like I was something inconvenient on his schedule. "Olivia, don't make this harder than it has to be." Harder. As if I hadn't spent the last 3 years making everything easier for him, while slowly disappearing from my own life. I placed the pen down and slid the papers forward. No tears, no argument, just silence. That was what surprised him most. "That's it?" he asked, almost disappointed. "No speech? No fight?" I stood up slowly, adjusting my coat. "What exactly would I be fighting for, Daniel? A version of me you stopped seeing years ago?" His jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't answer. That was Daniel's way. He didn't argue with things he thought were already decided. Before everything collapsed into this moment, there were signs I ignored. Small things. Conversations that didn't include me anymore. Decisions made without me. Dinners where I felt like a guest in my own marriage. I remember one night clearly, about 6 months before this, when I said, "You've been distant lately. Is everything okay?" He didn't even pause. "I'm just busy, Olivia. Not everything is about you." That sentence stayed with me longer than I admitted to anyone. Not everything is about you. I started to learn how to shrink after that. How to speak less. How to ask fewer questions. How to exist in a space that was slowly turning me into background noise. But what Daniel never knew, what no one in his world ever bothered to ask, was what I was doing when I wasn't being seen, when I wasn't being heard, when I wasn't being counted. The night I signed those papers, the apartment felt too quiet. Even the city outside our window looked like it had moved on without me. Daniel finally stood up, grabbing his coat. "My lawyer will handle the rest," he said. "You'll get the details next week." Then he paused at the door. "Olivia, this is better for both of us." I almost believed he meant it. Almost. "Right," I said softly. "Better." And then he left. No hesitation, no backward glance. Just gone. I stood there for a long time after that, staring at the empty space where he had been, realizing something strange. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I wasn't broken either. I was just quiet. Too quiet. Like something underneath that silence had not been resolved, only delayed. I walked to the window, looking down at the streetlights of Chicago flickering against the wet pavement. Somewhere out there, life was still moving normally. People were going home, making dinner, laughing, living inside realities that hadn't cracked open yet. But mine had. And what Daniel didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that the divorce papers he thought ended everything were actually only the beginning of something he never saw coming. Because there was a reason I signed without resistance. A reason I didn't fight back. A reason the silence in that room felt heavier than any argument we could have had. And that reason started long before this night, in a place Daniel never once thought to look, where decisions were made that would eventually bring the entire truth into the light. The part he never saw coming wasn't the divorce. It was what had already been set in motion before I ever touched that pen. The silence in that apartment did not feel new to me. It felt familiar, like something I had been living inside for years without realizing it had a shape. After Daniel left, I stood there staring at the empty hallway, but my mind was no longer in that room. It was somewhere far back, long before signatures and courtrooms, before divorce papers and cold conversations. It was back in a house in suburban Ohio where I first learned what it meant to be invisible in your own family. I was 12 years old the first time I understood. I was not the favored version of myself in that home. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with a cracked ceramic plate in front of me, while my younger brother, Ethan, got the new glass plate set my mother had just bought from a catalog. "Be careful with those," she told him gently, adjusting his fork like he was made of glass. Then she looked at me and said, "Olivia, you can use the old ones. You are responsible enough." Responsible enough. It sounded like praise when I was younger. Later I realized it was just another word for less important. My father rarely spoke during meals, but when he did, it was usually about Ethan. "He has my mind," he once said proudly, watching my brother talk about a science project involving circuits and batteries. I remember trying to show him my own school essay that I had worked on for days. "Dad, I wrote this about local history in our town," I said, placing it near his newspaper. He barely glanced at it. "That is nice, Olivia. Maybe your mother can read it later." Later never came. I learned quickly that attention in my house was not distributed evenly. It was earned through something I did not seem to have. Even my achievements felt smaller in their eyes. When I won a state-level academic award in high school, my mother said, "That is good, sweetheart. Did Ethan finish his math competition yet?" As if my success was just a pause between his accomplishments. There were small moments that shaped me more than big arguments ever could. Like the time I saved up my part-time job money to buy a simple watch for my father's birthday. I wrapped it carefully, wrote a note, and placed it on the table. When he opened it, he smiled politely and said, "You did not need to spend your money on this." Then Ethan walked in later with a store-bought card, and suddenly the room was alive again with laughter. "Now this is thoughtful," my father said, holding up the card my brother barely signed. I remember sitting there, watching that moment unfold, like I was not part of the same family. No one noticed I had gone quiet. I just learned to disappear better after that. At school, I became the reliable one, the one teachers trusted, the one classmates asked for help. But at home, I was the background character who always cleaned up after dinner, always remembered the grocery list, always made things easier for everyone else without being asked. "You are so mature for your age," my mother would say, brushing past me as she focused on Ethan's schedule, Ethan's grades, Ethan's future. I used to think maturity was a compliment. Later I understood it was just expectation disguised as praise. When I got accepted into college on a partial scholarship, I stood in the kitchen holding the acceptance letter. "I got in," I said, trying to sound like it mattered. My father glanced up briefly. "Good. You should study something practical." My mother added, "Make sure it is something that leads to stability, not like those uncertain majors people choose when they do not think ahead." Ethan, already in high school, said, "I think I want to study business at a top school." And suddenly the conversation shifted again. My moment became background noise. I remember that night sitting on my bed, looking at the acceptance letter again and wondering why it did not feel like victory. It felt like permission, like I had finally been allowed into a space where no one was waiting for me. Years later, I built a life far from that house. I built my career carefully, quietly, without telling anyone at home how far I had actually gone, because I had learned something important early on. Sharing success in a place that never expected it from you only invites doubt, not celebration. So, I stayed silent. I let them believe I was still just managing things, still just getting by, even when I was no longer that person at all. Back in the present, standing alone in that Chicago apartment, I could feel all of that history pressing against the silence. Daniel had never asked me about any of it, not my past, not my work, not the parts of me that existed before him. To him, I had always been simple, manageable, replaceable. I walked slowly to the kitchen counter where the divorce papers still lay, edges slightly curled now. My reflection in the glass window behind them looked unfamiliar, like someone who had spent too long being underestimated. That was when my phone vibrated. One message, from an unknown number. "We need to talk about Daniel Carter's financial records. It is worse than you think." I did not move right away. I just stared at the message, feeling something shift, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. Like a door I did not know existed had just been opened somewhere far behind me. And for the first time since signing those papers, I understood something simple and unsettling. The story Daniel thought had ended was not even close to finished, and somewhere in the silence of my past, I had already become something he never saw coming. The message on my phone did not disappear. It stayed there, glowing softly in the dark of my kitchen like it had been waiting for me longer than I had been ready to see it. We need to talk about Daniel Carter's financial records. It is worse than you think. I read it 3 times before I finally set the phone down. Not because I did not understand it, but because I understood it too well. Somewhere deep inside me, something old and quiet began to move again. The part of me that Daniel never bothered to see, the part that had been watching everything long before he ever thought I was paying attention. The next morning, I met the sender in a small cafe 2 blocks from my apartment. His name was Michael Reeves, a forensic financial analyst I had worked with once on a compliance project 2 years earlier. He looked the same, tired eyes, careful posture, like someone who had seen too many numbers that did not add up. He slid a folder across the table without speaking at first. "I should not even have this," he finally said. I opened it slowly. Inside were bank transfers, offshore accounts, and internal company reports tied directly to Daniel's signature. Not rumors, not speculation, paper trails, clean, structured, undeniable. "How long has this been going on?" I asked quietly. Michael leaned back, lowering his voice. "Years, maybe longer. It looks like he has been moving funds through subsidiaries that were never disclosed in divorce filings or court disclosures. If this goes into federal review, it will not stay civil for long." I closed the folder but did not let go of it. "Why tell me?" I asked. He hesitated. "Because your name is on some of these internal approvals, not as an accomplice." As someone who flagged discrepancies that were ignored, I felt something tighten in my chest. Not fear. Recognition. I remembered those moments. Late nights when I questioned invoices, when I asked Daniel why certain accounts did not match, when he smiled and told me I was overthinking things. "You are not an accountant, Olivia," he used to say. "Let me handle the money." And I had let him handle everything I did not yet understand was already slipping out of control. Michael tapped the folder lightly. "If you are involved in this case, even indirectly, the federal review will likely include you as a witness. A witness. Not a wife, not an ex-wife. A witness." The word felt strange in my mouth when I said it out loud. "So what happens now?" I asked. He looked at me carefully. "Now you decide if you want to stay silent, or if you want to understand how deep this goes before it reaches court." That was the moment I felt it. The shift. Not loud, not dramatic. Just irreversible. I went back home that afternoon, but the apartment felt different. Smaller somehow. Like it had been waiting for me to stop pretending I did not see what was happening. Daniel called me once that evening. I let it ring until voicemail. "Olivia," his voice said when I finally listened. Calm, controlled. "I hope you are adjusting. My attorney will finalize everything soon. Let us keep this simple." Simple. I almost laughed, because nothing about what I had just seen was simple anymore. The next day, something unexpected happened. I received a formal request to attend a preliminary federal review session as a witness related to financial disclosure irregularities. It was not a court summons. Not yet. But it carried weight. Real weight. I remember standing in front of my mirror that morning, staring at myself like I was trying to recognize the version of me that Daniel thought he had left behind. At the federal building, everything felt colder than I expected. Not hostile, just final. The kind of place where words had consequences. I was seated in a quiet room when a clerk walked in and said, "Miss Carter, they are ready for you." Inside the conference space, I saw people I did not know, attorneys, investigators, financial analysts. And then I saw Daniel. He looked up the moment I entered. His expression shifted, just slightly, like he had not expected me to be there in that capacity. "What is she doing here?" he asked immediately. No one answered him. A woman in a dark suit placed a file on the table. "This session concerns newly submitted financial discrepancies requiring clarification from multiple parties," she said. Daniel turned toward me. "Olivia, you do not need to be here. This is unnecessary." I did not sit down right away. I just looked at him. For the first time, I did not feel small in front of him. I felt aware. "I was asked to attend," I said calmly. "As a witness." The word changed something in his expression. Not fear yet, confusion. The meeting began. Numbers were displayed. Accounts were referenced. Transactions were questioned. Daniel tried to control the conversation at first, but the structure around him was tightening. Every explanation he gave was followed by another document he did not expect to exist. And then the atmosphere in the room changed. The lead investigator paused, reading something on his tablet. "We are going to need to place this under expanded review," he said. Daniel leaned forward. "Expanded review of what exactly?" That was when the door opened. Not forcefully, not dramatically, just decisively. 2 federal agents entered, carrying sealed documents. One of them spoke quietly to the investigator. The investigator nodded, then turned to the room. "This matter is now being escalated to Federal Financial Crime Review based on newly verified evidence of misappropriation and concealed asset transfers." The words hit the room like a weight settling into place. Daniel's face changed. Not instantly, slowly, like reality was adjusting itself around him. He looked at me again, but this time there was something different in his eyes. Not certainty. Not control. Something closer to uncertainty he had never allowed himself to feel before. I did not smile. I did not react. I just sat there, hands folded, watching the system he trusted begin to turn in a direction he did not choose. And as the agents placed the file on the table and the conversation shifted away from divorce entirely, I realized something very quietly. This was no longer about what he thought he had done to me. It was about everything he never bothered to see before it was already too late. The moment the federal agents entered the room, something shifted that I could feel before anyone even spoke. It was not fear yet. It was structure changing. The kind of silence that happens when authority stops being theoretical and becomes real. Daniel Carter sat across from me, still trying to hold on to control, like it was something he could negotiate his way back into. The investigator opened the file and began reading aloud, and that was when the first crack appeared in Daniel's story. These transfers were not disclosed in either civil filings or internal compliance reports, she said calmly. Daniel leaned forward immediately. "That is incorrect. Those accounts were fully reported through our legal team." He turned toward me sharply, like I was supposed to support him. "Olivia, you know this. You reviewed those documents with me." Every head in the room shifted slightly toward me. I felt it immediately, the pressure of being pulled back into a version of myself I had already left behind. I looked at him, and for the first time, I did not adjust my voice to make him comfortable. "I reviewed what you showed me," I said, "not what you omitted." A pause followed. Not dramatic, just heavy. The investigator flipped to the next page. "There are additional transactions routed through shell entities tied to Carter Holdings subsidiaries," she continued. Daniel exhaled sharply. "That is a misunderstanding of structure. Those are operational accounts." But something had changed. I could see it in the way the room was no longer following his rhythm. The investigator was no longer reacting to his explanations. She was verifying them against something he had not seen yet. Daniel turned slightly toward his attorney. "This is being taken out of context," he said, his voice tighter now. "We can clarify this immediately." His attorney did not respond right away. That hesitation was the first real silence Daniel could not control. Then it started. 1 document became 3. 3 became 12. Each one was placed on the table without urgency, but with precision. And with each page, the story Daniel had built about himself began to weaken in real time. I remembered something he had told me once at dinner, months before everything collapsed. He had laughed while pouring himself a glass of wine and said, "People only see what you let them see." At the time, I thought it was confidence. Now I understood it differently. It was limitation. A belief that control meant hiding things well enough that no one would ever look twice. But someone had looked. The investigator spoke again. "We also have confirmation of misrepresented asset valuations in 2 separate filings." Daniel immediately interrupted. "That is not accurate. Those valuations were audited." His voice rose slightly this time, still controlled, but no longer effortless. I could feel him trying to pull the room back under his influence. It was not working. A federal agent placed another folder down, this one thicker than the rest. "This includes third-party verification of discrepancies between reported income and actual fund distribution," he said. Daniel's head turned slightly toward me again. "Olivia," he said, slower this time, Tell them, you know how these reports are structured. There it was, the attempt to bring me back into his version of reality, the version where I existed only as someone who validated him. I felt something settle in me. Not anger, not satisfaction, just clarity. I am not here to interpret your reports, I said quietly. I am here because they already have mine. That was the moment the room changed again. Daniel froze, not dramatically, just long enough for uncertainty to enter his expression. Your reports? He repeated. The investigator nodded once and slid a separate document forward. Miss Carter submitted independent compliance observations 6 months prior to divorce proceedings, she said. Daniel looked down at the page. I could see the exact second he understood what that meant. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. His voice dropped. You were investigating me? The word landed between us like something unfamiliar. I shook my head slightly. I was documenting what I was asked to ignore. A low murmur moved through the room. The attorney beside him shifted in his seat. The structure Daniel had relied on his entire life, the assumption that he controlled the narrative, was no longer stable. The investigator continued reading. Based on these combined submissions, preliminary assessment indicates intentional misrepresentation across multiple financial disclosures. Daniel stood up slightly from his chair. This is becoming a mischaracterization of standard corporate accounting practices, he said quickly. But the words no longer carried weight. Not here. Not in this room. Because evidence had replaced interpretation. I watched him carefully. This was the part I had never seen before. Not the confident executive, not the controlled husband. But the moment a person realizes the system they trusted is no longer responding to them. He leaned forward slightly. Olivia, if this is about the divorce settlement, we can resolve that separately. His voice softened for the first time, not out of kindness, out of necessity, but I did not answer. Because at that exact moment, the investigator received a message on her tablet. She read it once, then looked up. The silence that followed was not normal silence. It was procedural silence. The kind that comes right before something irreversible is acknowledged. And when she finally spoke, her words did not belong to Daniel's world anymore. We are pausing this session for immediate escalation review based on newly confirmed federal jurisdiction alignment. The room did not react immediately. It needed a second to translate what that meant. Daniel understood first. I saw it in his face. Not panic, not shock, something worse. Loss of control. The agents moved closer to the table, not aggressively, but decisively. Papers were gathered, files were reclassified, voices lowered. And in that quiet restructuring of authority, Daniel's entire argument stopped existing. He turned toward me one last time, but there was nothing behind his eyes anymore, except the realization that the version of the story he had been telling himself had already ended somewhere he did not notice. And as the room dissolved into procedural motion, I realized something very still and very clear. This was no longer about proving anything. It was about what had already been proven without him ever realizing he was being measured at all. After the hearing was paused, the room did not return to normal. It never does after authority steps in and changes the direction of a life in real time. Daniel Carter was escorted into a separate review room, not arrested, not yet charged, but no longer in control of anything that used to respond to his voice. I remained in the original chamber for a moment longer, still seated, still watching the table where his confidence used to sit so comfortably. Now there were only scattered documents, half-closed folders, and silence that felt heavier than any argument he had ever won. When I finally stepped outside, the hallway of the federal building felt longer than I remembered. My heels echoed against the polished floor, but there was no urgency in my movement. That was the strange part. Nothing was chasing me anymore, no expectation. No version of Daniel waiting to define what I was supposed to feel. My phone began to vibrate before I even reached the exit. The first call was from Daniel's attorney. I let it ring, then again, and again. Finally, I answered. Olivia, we need to discuss immediate clarification statements, he said quickly. There has been a misunderstanding in how your submissions were interpreted. I stopped walking. There is no misunderstanding, I said calmly. There was a pause. You may want to reconsider your position, he continued. This can still be resolved privately. I looked out through the glass doors at the city beyond. Chicago looked unchanged. as if nothing inside that building had just shifted the direction of multiple lives. "I already submitted everything that needed to be submitted," I said. And I ended the call. The second wave began that evening. Emails. So many emails that I stopped counting after the first 10. Daniel's name appeared in different variations, different tones, different levels of desperation, disguised as professionalism. One subject line read, "Request for immediate private discussion." Another read, "This is being escalated unnecessarily." Then came the messages that no longer tried to sound formal. "Olivia, please respond. This is not what I agreed to. We can fix this without involving outside parties." "You are making a mistake." I read every one of them without replying, not because I was trying to punish him, because there was nothing left in those messages that required my participation. Late that night, my phone lit up again. Unknown number. I almost did not answer, but something in me already knew it was not Daniel this time. "Miss Carter," a female voice said, "this is Federal Compliance Liaison Office. We would like to confirm your availability for a formal statement continuation." I closed my eyes briefly. "When?" I asked. "Tomorrow morning," she replied. "You will be provided documentation for review prior to arrival." The call ended cleanly. No emotion. No explanation. Just procedure continuing without pause. The next morning, I arrived at a smaller office inside the federal complex. This room felt different. Less courtroom. More processing. More structured truth. A woman placed a thin folder in front of me. "We are not requesting testimony against your former spouse at this stage," she said. "We are clarifying your role as a reporting party." I nodded. "Understood." She flipped a page. "We also received attempted communications from Mr. Carter requesting mediation through private counsel channels." I exhaled slowly. I expected that. She looked up briefly. "Do you intend to respond to any of them?" That question stayed in the air longer than the others. I thought about Daniel sitting somewhere in a room, still trying to negotiate with something that no longer operated on negotiation. "No," I said finally. "I do not." After the meeting, I walked out into daylight that felt too normal for what had just happened inside. My phone vibrated again, but I already knew what it would be. I looked at the screen. 3 missed calls. 5 voicemails. I played the first one. "Olivia, this is getting out of control. I need you to talk to me. This is still our life. We can correct this." The second voicemail was shorter, his voice less controlled. "You are not thinking clearly." The third did not even try to sound calm. I deleted all 3 without finishing them. By the time I reached my apartment, there was a letter taped to my door, handwritten, not digital. Daniel always believed paper carried more sincerity. "Olivia," it began, "I do not understand why you are doing this. Whatever you think happened, we can fix it privately. I am asking you to reconsider before this goes further." I stood there for a long moment, holding the letter, reading the words that used to mean something to me before I learned how easily they could be used without truth behind them. I did not go inside right away. I just sat on the steps outside my building as the city moved around me. People passed by without noticing anything different about me. That was the final irony. Nothing about me looked like what had just happened inside my life. No one could see the distance that had formed between me and everything I used to belong to. My phone stayed silent after that, not because things were resolved, but because attempts had stopped working. Somewhere across the city, Daniel was still trying to reach a version of me that no longer answered to his voice. And I was sitting in a silence that no longer felt like absence, but like separation from everything I had once mistaken for connection. And in that stillness, I understood something I had not been able to see before. The most powerful moment was not when everything collapsed in front of him. It was when I stopped responding to the world he still believed I belonged to. The days after everything collapsed did not feel dramatic. They felt empty in a way that was harder to describe. No courtroom, no agents, no sudden interruptions, just silence stretching across normal hours like it had nowhere else to go. I stayed inside my apartment more than I should have, not because I was afraid, but because there was nothing outside waiting for me anymore that still felt familiar. Daniel stopped calling after the 3rd day. Not completely, just enough to make it feel intentional, like even his absence had structure. On the 4th day, I received a message from his sister Claire. "Olivia, I do not know what is happening between you and Daniel, but this is affecting the entire family. People are asking questions." I read it twice before responding. Then they should ask him, I typed. I did not send anything else. That same evening, I went to see my mother. I had not told her anything yet. Not the divorce, not the federal review, not the unraveling of everything I had once called my life. She opened the door and looked at me the way she always did when something felt off, but she could not name it. "You look tired," she said immediately. I stepped inside without answering. The house smelled the same as it always had, clean and controlled, like nothing in it ever broke. We sat in the kitchen. She poured tea without asking if I wanted any. That was her way. "Daniel called your father," she said carefully. "He said there are misunderstandings at work." I let out a slow breath. Of course he did. She looked at me more directly then. "Olivia, what is going on?" I hesitated. For a moment I thought about explaining everything in simple terms, something she could absorb without resistance. But there was no simple version of it anymore. "The divorce is no longer just a divorce," I said finally. She froze slightly, cup halfway to her lips. "What does that mean?" I did not answer immediately. Instead, I looked down at my hands. They looked the same as they always had. That was the strange part. Nothing physical about me reflected what was happening. "It means there are investigations now," I said quietly. "Financial ones." She put the cup down slowly. "Is Daniel in trouble?" I nodded once. That was all. The room changed after that. Not loudly. Just enough that I could feel it in the distance between us. "Olivia," she said more softly, "what did you do?" That question stayed in the air longer than anything else. Not accusatory, not angry, just uncertain. I looked at her and realized she was not seeing me as her daughter in that moment. She was trying to understand me as something that had stepped outside of expectation. "I did not do anything," I said. "I documented what was already happening." She did not respond right away. Then she stood up and walked to the sink, as if movement could reset the conversation. "Your father will not understand this," she said finally. "He already thinks Daniel is being targeted unfairly." I nodded slightly. "Then he will think that." I left after that. No argument followed me out. Just quiet confusion sitting behind me like something unresolved. That night, I did something I had not done in days. I checked my phone again. There were no new messages from Daniel, only one voicemail, left earlier but unnoticed. I pressed play. His voice sounded different this time. Not angry, not controlled, just tired. "Olivia, I am not trying to fight you," he said. "I just do not understand when everything changed." There was a pause. "If this is about trust, we can still fix it. Just tell me what you want." I stood in the dark of my living room while listening. For a moment, I almost believed he meant it. That old version of him, or at least the version I used to respond to, felt close enough to reach. But then I remembered the silence he left behind when I signed the papers. I deleted the voicemail. The next morning, I received a notice from the Federal Liaison Office. My cooperation status was no longer required for active questioning. The case had progressed beyond preliminary witness input. I read the sentence twice before understanding what it meant. I was no longer inside the process. I was outside it. That should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like distance. Not from danger, but from meaning. Later that day, I walked past a cafe near the river where Daniel and I used to meet early in our relationship. I did not go in. I just stood outside for a moment, watching people inside laugh, talk, exist inside versions of normal that no longer included me. A message appeared on my phone again, this time from an unknown number. "Final audit review has been scheduled. Your documentation is now the primary reference." I stared at it without reacting. Somewhere, something had reached its final stage. Not with noise, not with collapse, but with completion. And as I stood there watching the reflection of city lights on the river, I realized something had already begun shifting underneath everything I thought I had lost, something I could not fully see yet, but could already feel beginning to rise again. For a long time after everything collapsed, I did not rebuild my life in the way people imagine. There was no dramatic reset, no sudden reinvention. It started quietly, with small decisions made in silence. The first thing I did was return to work, not because I felt ready, but because I needed something in my life that still responded to structure instead of emotion. I walked into the office of Meridian Compliance Group on a Monday morning at exactly 8:05 a.m., wearing the same black coat I had worn for years, but feeling like it belonged to someone else. My supervisor, Karen Mitchell, looked up from her desk as I entered. "I thought you were taking extended leave," she said. I placed my bag down and shook my head slightly. "I am back," I replied simply. She studied me for a moment. "After everything with your divorce?" I paused, then nodded. "Especially after everything." There were no further questions after that. That was the difference between people who knew your history and people who only knew your present usefulness. My first assignment came 2 days later. A corporate restructuring review for a mid-sized logistics firm in Illinois. Nothing glamorous. Just data, compliance checks, and financial flow analysis. But for me, it was grounding. Numbers did not lie the way people did. I stayed late that night, long after the office lights dimmed, reviewing transaction logs and flagged inconsistencies. At one point, a junior analyst walked by my desk and said, "You are still here?" I did not look up. "I need to understand the full structure before tomorrow," I said. He hesitated. "Most people just wait for the summary report." I finally looked at him then. That is why most people miss things. Word about my return spread quietly. Not dramatically. Just enough that people began assigning me the cases others avoided. Difficult ones, complicated ones, the ones with missing pieces that no one wanted to connect. One afternoon, Karen called me into her office. She closed the door behind me. "You have been working non-stop since you came back," she said. "You know you do not have to prove anything here." I sat across from her. "I am not proving anything," I said. "I am rebuilding understanding." She tilted her head slightly. "Of what?" I hesitated only for a moment. "Of what I missed before." She did not push further. Instead, she slid a file toward me. "Then you might want to look at this acquisition audit. Something does not align in their internal transfers." I opened it, and immediately something felt familiar. Not the company, not the structure, the pattern, the same kind of missing alignment I had seen before. Later that week, I met with an external consultant named Brian Ellis, who had been brought in to assist on the same case. He leaned back in his chair and said, "You are very methodical for someone coming off a personal disruption." I responded without looking up from the documents. "Personal disruption does not affect structure recognition." He smiled slightly. "That sounds like something someone says when they have stopped trusting people." I finally looked at him. "It sounds like something someone says after they have learned not to." He did not respond to that. But he started treating my observations differently after that moment. Outside of work, my life remained quiet. I did not return to old circles. I did not explain myself to anyone who had already decided what my story meant. One evening, I received a message from Claire, Daniel's sister. "Olivia, things are getting worse on his side. He keeps asking if you will speak to him. I think he does not understand how far this has gone." I read it once, then set my phone down. I did not reply. Not because I felt anger, but because there was nothing left in that conversation that belonged to me anymore. Weeks passed, then months. My work began to change in scale. Larger cases, more responsibility. I was asked to present findings to executive boards, to explain irregularities that others had missed for years. At one of those meetings, a senior director said after I finished speaking, "You see patterns most people do not even know exist." I answered simply, "I used to ignore them too." There was a pause. "What changed?" he asked. I looked down at the report in front of me. I stopped assuming silence meant absence. That sentence stayed with me longer than I expected. One evening, as I was leaving the office, Karen stopped me at the elevator. "There is talk about promoting you to lead compliance strategist for the regional division," she said. I turned slightly toward her. "I did not ask for that," she nodded. "I know. That is why it is being considered." The elevator doors opened, but I did not step inside immediately. I looked at the reflection in the metal walls and saw someone I did not recognize from a year ago. Not because I had changed outwardly, but because I no longer felt like I was waiting to be defined by someone else's version of me. "Olivia," Karen said softly, "you are not where you were." I stepped into the elevator. "No," I said quietly, "I am not." The doors closed. As the elevator descended, my phone buzzed once more. A notification from an unknown legal channel. Final compliance review findings scheduled for executive confirmation next week. I stared at the screen as the building moved upward around me. Something was approaching its conclusion. Not my life, not my work. Something else entirely that had been unfolding long before I ever realized I was part of it. And for the first time, I understood that what was coming next was not about what had already happened, but about what had been quietly building in the background while I was busy learning how to stand on my own again. The message on my phone faded out as I stepped out of the elevator, but its weight did not leave me. Final compliance review findings scheduled for executive confirmation next week. That sentence stayed in my mind like a quiet signal I could not yet interpret. The days after that moved differently. Not slower, not faster, just more focused. At Meridian Compliance Group, my role expanded without announcement, without ceremony. One morning, I arrived at the office and found a new identification badge waiting on my desk. My name was printed in clean black letters, Olivia Carter, Senior Compliance Strategy Lead. Below it, a second line that I had not seen before, Federal Review Liaison Unit. I held it for a moment longer than I expected to. It did not feel like promotion. It felt like recognition of something that had already been happening without permission. Karen Mitchell walked past my desk and stopped briefly. "You should attend the executive briefing today," she said. I looked up. I was not scheduled. She smiled slightly. "You are now, at 9:00 a.m. I entered a glass conference room overlooking downtown Chicago. The city stretched beyond the windows, indifferent and steady. On the table in front of me were printed reports, system audits, and structural summaries of cases I had been working on for weeks. Across the room, executives from 3 different divisions were already seated. One of them, a senior director I had never met before, glanced at my badge and raised an eyebrow. "That is a new title," he said. I sat down calmly. "It reflects updated responsibilities," I replied. He leaned back slightly. "And what exactly do those responsibilities include?" I opened the first folder without hesitation. Identifying structural inconsistencies across compliance frameworks that have been previously overlooked. There was a brief silence. Not skepticism this time. Evaluation. As I spoke through the findings, I noticed something I had not seen before in rooms like this. They were listening differently. Not because I spoke louder or more confidently, but because the information no longer needed permission to be understood. After the meeting, one of the executives approached me in the hallway. "Carter, right?" he said. I nodded. "We have been reviewing your escalation reports," he continued. "Your pattern recognition on cross-entity transfers is unusually precise." I responded simply, "It is based on repetition, not assumption." He studied me for a moment. "You used to work in legal advisory before this?" I paused briefly. "I used to work in observation," I said. He smiled faintly as if unsure whether that was a serious answer. But I was not joking. Later that afternoon, I was assigned to a federal coordination briefing. It was a closed session, held in a secure conference room with limited access. When I entered, I noticed something immediately. The atmosphere was different, not tense, controlled. On the far side of the table, I recognized one of the federal analysts from earlier sessions. He nodded once when he saw me. "Miss Carter," he said, "we have integrated your documentation into the final review matrix." I took my seat. Understood. As the session progressed, I was no longer just observing. I was being referenced. Data points I had flagged weeks earlier were now part of formal investigative structure. One of the analysts turned toward me at one point. "Your initial submission identified inconsistencies that aligned with later confirmed findings," he said. "That level of accuracy is not typical from external contributors." I replied without emotion. It was not external, it was contextual. He did not ask what that meant. He did not need to. By the end of the session, my role had shifted again, though no one announced it. I was no longer reacting to information. I was shaping how it was being interpreted. That evening, I returned to my apartment and placed my new identification badge on the counter. The light from the window reflected off the plastic surface, making the letters appear sharper than they were in reality. My phone buzzed once. A message from an unknown internal system, executive review preparation scheduled for final disclosure alignment. I read it twice, not because I did not understand it, but because I did. Somewhere, the structure I had been moving through for months was reaching its final configuration, and for the first time I was not standing outside of it. I was already inside the part that determined what came next. I looked out of the window at the city again. Chicago had not changed, but my position within it had. And as I turned away from the glass, I understood something very clearly. The next time I would see Daniel Carter would not be in silence or memory. It would be in a place where every decision made before this moment would finally become visible in real time. The morning of the final executive review arrived without warning, but I felt it before I even left my apartment. Not as anxiety, but as structure tightening around something that had been loose for too long. Chicago looked the same through the window of the car that picked me up, but I no longer experienced the city the same way. Every intersection felt like a transition point towards something already decided somewhere else. The Meridian Compliance Group badge on my jacket felt heavier than it should have, not physically but symbolically, like it had stopped representing a job and started representing access to something irreversible. When I arrived at the Federal Coordination Building, I was escorted directly to a secure conference level. The hallway was quieter than I remembered from previous visits, the kind of silence that exists when decisions have already been made and the meeting is only a formality. A security officer checked my identification twice before nodding me forward. "They are waiting for you in room 7, he said. I did not respond, only continued walking. Inside the room, the lighting was slightly dimmed, not dramatic, just controlled. A long table sat at the center, surrounded by analysts, legal advisors, and federal representatives. At the far end, I noticed Daniel Carter immediately. He was already seated, hands resting on the table, posture straight but not relaxed. He looked different from the last time I saw him in the previous review, less confident, more contained, like someone trying to hold a version of himself together in real time. When his eyes found mine, he did not speak immediately. Neither did I. A federal liaison gestured for me to take a seat. "Miss Carter, please confirm your presence for final clarification review," she said. I nodded once, confirmed. Daniel leaned slightly forward. "Olivia," he said carefully, as if testing whether the name still worked in this setting. "This is unnecessary escalation. Whatever has been submitted can be resolved directly between us." The room did not react. No one interrupted him. That silence itself was the response. I sat down across from him, placing my folder on the table. "This is not between us anymore," I said calmly. His jaw tightened slightly. "You are letting them interpret things you do not fully understand," he said. I looked at him directly. "I understand everything that was submitted under my name." That was the first time he paused without immediately responding. A federal analyst on my right opened a file and began speaking. "We will proceed with final validation of cross-referenced financial documentation and compliance reports," he said. Screens behind him illuminated, rows of data appeared, account structures, transaction chains, verification timelines. Daniel shifted in his chair. "These are being misrepresented," he said quickly. "I have already explained the context of those transfers." No one answered him immediately. Instead, the analyst turned to me. "Miss Carter, do you confirm the authenticity of your original flagged submissions?" I did not hesitate. "Yes," I said. Daniel turned toward me sharply. "Olivia, you cannot seriously be validating this without reviewing updated reconciliations," he said, his voice rising slightly. I kept my voice even. "I reviewed everything I needed to review months ago." The phrase landed differently in the room this time, not as opinion, as conclusion. The analyst continued. "We have now received final corroboration from independent audit channels confirming discrepancies across multiple fiscal cycles." Daniel exhaled sharply. "This is being pulled out of proportion," he said. "You are treating standard corporate restructuring as criminal interpretation." A second federal officer placed a sealed envelope on the table. "This is not interpretation," she said quietly. "This is verification." The room shifted again. I could feel it in the stillness. Not tension anymore. Transition. Daniel looked around the table as if searching for someone who would interrupt this process on his behalf. No one did. His voice lowered slightly when he spoke again. "Olivia, please. You know me. You know how these things get misunderstood under review pressure." That was the first time his tone changed from control to familiarity. Not authority, memory. I looked at him, and for the first time since this began, I felt how far away that version of him already was. "I do know you," I said quietly. "That is why I documented everything." A silence followed that was different from all the others. It was not procedural. It was final before revelation. The federal liaison opened the envelope, slowly, carefully, as if timing mattered more than urgency. Daniel watched her hands, I did as well. The paper inside was not yet visible, but I could feel the shift building toward it, like the moment just before a structure reveals what it has been holding all along. The liaison looked up briefly before speaking. Daniel did not blink. I did not move. And then she began to read the first line. The moment the federal liaison began reading from the sealed document, the entire room seemed to narrow into a single point of attention. No one moved. No one interrupted. Even Daniel Carter, who had controlled every room I had ever seen him in, sat perfectly still, as if movement itself might accelerate the outcome he could no longer influence. The liaison's voice was calm, measured, almost administrative, but every word she spoke carried irreversible weight. Preliminary verification confirms structured financial misrepresentation across multiple corporate entities associated with Carter Holdings Group, she read. A quiet shift passed through the table, not loud enough to be called reaction, but sharp enough to be felt. Daniel leaned forward slightly. That is incorrect framing, he said immediately. Those entities are part of legitimate operational restructuring. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it now that had not been there before. Not confidence. Correction without control. The liaison continued without acknowledging him. Further review confirms undisclosed asset transfers routed through secondary accounts not listed in either civil or compliance disclosures. That was when I saw it. Not panic in Daniel, not yet, but something closer to recognition. The kind that arrives when a person realizes they are no longer participating in the interpretation of their own life. He turned toward me slowly. Olivia, he said, quieter now. You knew this was going to be read like this. I did not respond immediately. I looked at him the way I had learned to look at data that finally made sense after weeks of missing pieces. I knew what was documented, I said. The liaison placed a second sheet on the table. We also have corroborated internal reports submitted by Miss Carter during the active period of financial oversight, she said. At that, Daniel's expression changed for the first time in a way that was not controlled. He looked at the paper, then at me, then back again. You submitted reports? He asked, but this time it was not accusatory. It was disbelief trying to reconstruct itself into something stable. I nodded once. I flagged inconsistencies when I saw them. His voice dropped slightly. Those were internal discussions, I replied evenly. They were ignored internal discussions. A silence followed that felt different from everything before it, not procedural, not investigative. Personal realization, entering a space that had previously belonged to authority. Daniel leaned back in his chair slowly, like his body was adjusting to information his mind had not prepared for. You were not supposed to be part of this, he said quietly. I looked at him. I was already part of it, I said. You just never noticed. The liaison turned another page. Final confirmation indicates intent is not being determined at this stage, she said. Only structure of action and consistency of reporting. Daniel let out a short breath. Olivia, he said again, softer now. This is going to affect everything. I held his gaze. It already did, I replied. There was no anger in my voice, no satisfaction, just distance. The kind that forms when a story is no longer shared between two people in the same way. Across the table, one of the federal analysts leaned forward slightly. For clarity, he said, addressing me directly. Do you maintain that your submissions were made independently and without external influence? I nodded. Yes. Daniel looked at the analyst. She does not understand the full context of what she is validating, he said quickly. This is a misinterpretation of internal corporate accounting practices. The analyst did not respond to Daniel. Instead, he continued looking at me. Miss Carter, do you confirm awareness that your documentation forms the primary basis for this phase of review? There was a pause. Not hesitation, just awareness. Yes, I said. Daniel exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head slightly. This is becoming something it was never meant to become, he said under his breath. I finally turned toward him fully. It became this the moment you believed I would never look closely, I said quietly. That sentence did not come with emotion. It came with clarity. The liaison closed the folder in front of her. The sound was soft, but final in a way that made the entire room adjust unconsciously. At this stage, she said, the findings will proceed to Executive Federal Review Board confirmation. Daniel sat very still now, not arguing, not correcting, just listening. For the first time, there was nothing left in his posture that suggested control, only awareness. He looked at me again, and this time there was no attempt to pull me back into anything familiar. Only recognition that whatever I had been in his life before this moment was no longer accessible to him in the way he once assumed. "So this is it," he said quietly. I did not answer immediately, because it was not yet about endings. It was about understanding that something had already ended long before this room ever formed around us. And as the liaison stood and gathered the remaining documents, I felt something shift that no longer belonged to shock or anger. It belonged to distance becoming permanent. And in that silence, as Daniel finally stopped speaking altogether, I understood that the version of my life I had once tried to hold together had not just been questioned, it had already been replaced by something neither of us could undo. After the final confirmation hearing ended, nothing about the world outside the federal building felt the same anymore. Not because the city had changed, but because I had. The structure of what had just happened inside that room did not stay behind when I left it. It followed me into every step, every sound, every silence between thoughts. Daniel Carter did not speak to me as we exited. He did not try to stop me. He did not attempt another explanation. The version of control he had carried into that room had dissolved too completely for him to reconstruct it in real time. But the consequences did not end at the building doors. They began there. By the time I returned to my apartment that evening, I already had 4 missed calls from Claire, his sister, 2 messages from an unknown number I later recognized as his father's assistant, and 1 voicemail that I did not play immediately. I stood by the window for a long time before listening. The city below moved normally. Cars stopping at lights, people walking with groceries, life continuing in a way that felt almost disconnected from what had unfolded just hours earlier. When I finally pressed play, Claire's voice came through first. "Olivia, people are asking questions everywhere. Daniel is saying this is being misunderstood at a federal level. My father does not know what to believe anymore." There was a pause, then softer, less controlled. "If you know anything that can help, please say something." I set the phone down without replying. A second voicemail followed from Daniel himself. "Olivia," he said. And for the first time, his voice did not carry authority or structure. It carried uncertainty. "This is becoming bigger than it needs to be. I do not know what you think you are achieving, but you are not seeing the full picture." I deleted it without finishing. The next morning, I received an email from my mother. The subject line was simple: "We need to talk." I knew what it meant before I opened it. When I arrived at her house later that afternoon, she was already waiting at the kitchen table, hands folded tightly, as if she had been holding that position for too long. My father stood near the window, not speaking. The atmosphere was not anger. It was disbelief trying to organize itself into language. "Your father spoke with Daniel's legal team," my mother began carefully. I sat down across from them without hesitation. "And?" I asked. My father finally turned. "They are saying you are the primary source of this entire federal escalation," he said. I nodded slightly. "That is accurate." My mother's expression tightened. "Olivia, do you understand what that means for this family?" I looked at her. "I understand exactly what it means." A silence followed. Not unfamiliar, just heavier now. My father spoke again, slower this time. "You are not just involved in a divorce anymore. This is becoming something we cannot control from the outside." I held his gaze. "You were never controlling it," I said calmly. That sentence landed differently, not as defiance, as clarification. My mother shook her head slightly. "You are talking like this is just paperwork," she said. "This is Daniel's entire future." I responded without raising my voice. His future was built on structures I was asked not to question. My father leaned forward slightly. "You are saying he is guilty?" I paused. Not because I was uncertain, because I was precise. "I am saying I reported what I documented," I replied. Another silence followed, this one longer. My mother's voice softened slightly. "Olivia, there are consequences to being the person who pushes things this far." I looked at her. "There were consequences long before I ever spoke," I said quietly. She did not respond to that. When I left their house, no one followed me to the door. No one tried to stop me. That was the moment I understood something clearly. I was no longer inside anyone's version of this story. I was outside all of them. Later that evening, I walked past a cafe near my apartment, where Daniel and I had once sat during what now felt like another lifetime. The chairs were still arranged the same way. The windows still reflected the same city. But I did not stop this time. My phone buzzed again as I walked. Another message from Claire. He is not speaking to anyone now. He just keeps saying you were supposed to understand him. I stared at the message for a moment, then typed one response. I did understand him. I did not send anything else. That night, I stood alone in my apartment again, but it no longer felt like silence was something pressing against me. It felt like space expanding, not comfort, not resolution. Just distance becoming permanent between what had been and what could no longer return. Somewhere in that distance, Daniel's world was still reacting, still trying to stabilize itself around what had already been revealed, but mine was no longer connected to it in the same way. And even though nothing was fully resolved, I could feel something settling into place that had nothing to do with closure and everything to do with separation that could not be undone. I did not feel the ending of everything the way people describe in stories. There was no single moment where life suddenly became perfect again. Instead, there was a long silence that followed the storm, and in that silence, I had to learn how to exist without constantly bracing for impact. Daniel Carter's case moved into its final federal review phase weeks after I last saw him in that room. I did not attend the final hearing. I did not need to. My role had already shifted from participant to reference point, from person inside the story to someone whose documentation defined its structure. When the official confirmation report was issued, I received it like everyone else in the chain. Clean language, structured outcomes, final classifications, no emotion attached to any of it. Daniel was no longer the center of my days. He had become part of a closed file, something that existed in records, not in my present life. I remember sitting at my desk at Meridian Compliance Group the morning after the final confirmation email arrived. My badge still hung around my neck, but it felt different now, not like permission, but like placement. Karen Mitchell walked by and placed a small folder on my desk. "Your role will be expanding into national oversight," she said casually. I looked up. "That was fast," I replied. She gave a small nod. "It was already decided. You just were not officially inside the structure yet." That sentence stayed with me longer than I expected. I had spent so much of my life thinking I was trying to become something, but in reality, I had already been part of systems I did not fully recognize until everything else fell away. Outside of work, the world slowly stopped reacting to my past. Claire stopped messaging. My parents stopped asking indirect questions. Even Daniel's name stopped appearing in conversations that were not legally required. Life did not return to what it was before. It simply stopped revolving around what had been broken. One afternoon, months later, I went back to my apartment and began packing things I had ignored for too long. Old documents, forgotten photos, objects that no longer belonged to any version of me I could recognize. In the back of a drawer, I found something I had not seen in years. A simple pen Daniel had given me early in our marriage. It was engraved with his initials. Something he used to say was, "A small reminder of precision." I held it for a moment, not because it meant anything anymore, but because it reminded me of how easily meaning can be assigned to things that later become empty. I placed it in a box and closed the lid. That was the moment I understood something quietly. Healing was not an event. It was repetition without emotional attachment. It was choosing not to reopen what had already been closed. Work continued to grow. My name appeared on more internal documents, more federal coordination summaries, more strategic oversight files. People began to speak to me differently in meetings, not because I demanded it, but because consistency creates its own authority over time. Yet none of it felt like victory. It felt like alignment. One evening, I stood by the window of my apartment and watched the city lights of Chicago stretch across the horizon. I thought about everything that had happened: the silence, the documents, the courtrooms, the moments where truth replaced assumption, and I realized something that did not feel dramatic, only honest. I had spent years trying to be understood by people who were never willing to look closely. And the moment I stopped asking for that understanding, everything around me changed. If there is one thing I learned through all of this, it is that your value is never defined by the person who refuses to see it. It is defined by what remains when their version of you is no longer in control. If you are watching this and you have ever felt unseen, unheard, or replaced in your own story, I want you to know something quietly and without pressure. You are not late to your own life. You are not behind. Sometimes clarity arrives only after silence has done its work. Protect your boundaries. Protect your peace. Protect your ability to see yourself clearly even when others cannot. And if you believe in something beyond what we can explain, trust that timing has its own intelligence, even when we do not understand it in the moment. My name is Olivia Carter. I am 34 years old, and the core lesson I carry from everything that happened is this. Your life does not begin when people finally recognize your worth. It begins the moment you stop waiting for them to decide it. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment about where you are watching from, and subscribe if you want to continue these journeys with me. Not every ending is loud. Some are quiet returns to yourself. And if you stay with this channel, the next story you hear may feel closer to your own life than you expect, because there are more truths waiting in the stories that follow, and each one carries a different kind of awakening you might not be ready for yet, but may need more than you realize.